Hi, Andrew Kramer here, and in this tutorial we're going to make a DVD menu with animation and transitions in between actions. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to make a new blank composition. Choosing new composition, we're going to use the NTSC DV preset, but if you use PAL, whichever preset applies to your location would be fine. I'm going to choose OK. Next thing I'm going to do is take this background image and just drag it out to the composition area. Alt-Home to take it to the beginning. I'm going to right-click on it in the composition window and choose Transform, Fit to Comp. And that will just basically scale it in. Now, I want to use this picture, but there's one little problem, is it's not quite centered. It was taken sort of from an angle, so I want to kind of cheat that and see if I can't create a uniform look. So with the layer selected, I'm going to choose Effect, Distort, Corner Pin. Then with the corner pin effect selected, I'm going to take these little nodes here in the composition window and just adjust them until I get kind of a straight line down here. And with the bars up here, I want that to also be sort of a straight line. So I'm just going to pull this one up. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to go ahead and pre-compose this layer into a new composition so that it's only rendering a small portion rather than the whole image every time we change it or add something to it. So I'm going to do Control-Shift-C to pre-compose, and I'm going to move all the attributes into the new composition, and I want to name this background. I'm going to choose OK. Now, because it's a DVD menu, we have a little opportunity to have some creativity. So I'm just going to add a little bit of character to this background, although it is pretty interesting all by itself. But let's see if we can enhance it. I'm going to choose Layer, New Solid, and we're just going to go with the black layer. And I'm going to select the elliptical mask tool and double click on it to create a mask the size of my layer. I'm going to select F on the keyboard to bring up the feather properties and just increase that a bunch. About 365 apparently. And I want to subtract this, and then I'm going to toggle F4 and bring up the transfer modes, and we're going to switch this transfer mode to classic color burn, and that kind of creates a burned on effect. And then it's a little intense, so I'm going to select the layer, hit the letter T, bring up the opacity and lower it so that it's not as intense. And then I want to just get a little bit more data here in the bottom, but I want to keep this color up here, so I'm just going to drag the bottom node of this mask down. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. Next thing I want to do is add another layer. So I'm going to choose Layer, New Solid, and this time I'm going to make like an orange layer, like a bright orange. I'm going to select OK, and also I'm going to name this Orange Light, and I'm going to select OK. And now I want to take the pen tool, and we're just going to cut it off kind of right about here in the corner. So I'm going to just make one way out here, down here, and then just kind of around. And the reason I'm making it so big is just because I'm going to feather it, and I just want to feather it without the sides kind of collapsing in. So if I make it too small, the sides will start coming in. So I just want it to be kind of very linear looking in the composition window. So that's why I just make this huge mask, Now also I want to bring the feather up a little bit more, and we're going to change the transfer mode here to Overlay. And so that kind of just creates a nice orange light coming down, and as you can see, it works very well with the green already on this side. So this kind of creates our nice background, but let's go ahead and add a few more touches. Now this is an animated background, so I want to see if I can just add some random noise to it by just creating a fractal. So let's go ahead and create a new solid, and it doesn't matter what color it is. I'm going to choose Effect, Noise and Grain, Fractal Noise. Okay. Now I was already playing with this early, so I kind of have an idea of what I want to achieve. So first of all, I want to pump up the contrast to about 900, which will basically get rid of a lot of the gray and just kind of give me almost a black and white image. So that's kind of what I want. And then I also want to get rid of as much white as I can. So I'm going to decrease the brightness so that I just kind of get some, maybe about -100. Then I'm going to go down to the transform properties and scale this up to 300, maybe even a little bit more, 350. Yeah, and then as you can see, the detail kind of gets lost. So I want to increase the complexity, which is kind of like how much noise is in the image, to maybe about 10. Okay, so that brings back a lot of the detail, which looks a lot better. Now there's another effect that will kind of give us a more organic feel. Now this looks great, but I want to take it just another step forward. So I'm going to choose Effects, Blur, CC Vector Blur. Now this vector blur is a very interesting effect, and it basically analyzes the image and just creates a very unusual effect. So I'm going to go ahead and decrease the amount to about -30. And that just already, you can see it's just creating this very organic kind of liquidy look, but we want to kind of get away from the liquidy look and more kind of go for like a, sub-microscope, like a virus kind of feel, or maybe like a grungy feel. So let's see if we can make some other changes here. I'm going to make the ridge smoothness a lot more. So I'm just going to slide it up here, maybe 100. Okay, so you can see that kind of gives us a similar look to what we had originally, but now if we change the softness down to a really small number, you can see it kind of just creates like dirt particles almost, and we can smooth these out a little bit more, maybe going up to a slightly higher value. So as you can see, this is a very interesting effect, and what we do next with it is going to be even more interesting. Now I want to go back to the fractal noise effects for a second and go over a couple of things. I want to change the evolution of this effect so that it kind of cycles through, and basically so it animates. Now there's a really, really good way of animating something over a 20-second period in which this composition is set to. And that is to cycle the evolution so that this effect basically loops. So I'm going to go to the beginning here, turn the stopwatch on for the evolution, and go to the very end and set the revolutions to 2. Now this is the revolutions, meaning one whole 360-degree turn, and you can also go to the degrees and change it there, but we're just going to stay with 2 entire revolutions. So if I cycle through here, you can see it's going around. Now there's a great option in here under the evolution options that allows us to cycle the evolution, and what that means is we can tell it to loop or come back to its original spot after a certain amount of cycles. So in this case, we'll set it to 2, or the same as our original evolution, so that now when we cycle through, at the end point, it will actually be exactly what it is at the beginning point here. So if I hit home and end, you'll see that they're exactly the same. So that's kind of a cool thing. Now, if we change the cycle to 3, we also need to change the evolution to 3 on the last keyframe for it to loop properly. So, but for this particular case, I'm just going to go ahead and keep it at 2 revolutions and 2 revolutions. Okay, now I want to invert this effect. I want the white area to be actually black so that it kind of looks like dirt rather than kind of the inverse of it. So with the layer selected, I'm going to choose Effect, Channel, Invert, and there we have it. Now, we're going to change the transfer mode for this layer to Classic Color Burn, as we've done earlier. And you can see we're getting a very, very creepy looking effect, but I want to kind of really tone it down. So I'm going to hit T on the keyboard, bring up the opacity, and we're just going to drop it down, way down, maybe about 10. So you can see it creates kind of an interesting effect, to say the least. But I want to kind of take this a step further, and I want to duplicate it and offset it to kind of create more random noise. But what I've prepared for us is a pre-rendered version of this layer so that we don't have to keep rendering this layer out. And all I did was took the layer before I added the transfer mode at full opacity and rendered it out as a QuickTime movie, and then re-imported it into the project so that instead of having to render out the fractal noise and the vector blur, we can just use a pre-made piece of footage. So I'm going to go and keep this layer here so that you guys can play with the settings. So I'm going to name it, we're going to call it fractal noise, and I'm going to lock it and shut the eye off so that we don't have to come back to it. But I'm going to take this fractal noise movie that's pre-rendered, drag it out, Alt Home. So it's very complicated effects, but since it's rendered out, it's very fast and we can work very quickly. So I'm going to change the transfer mode back to classic color burn, hit T and change the opacity back down to 10. Now I want to right click on my movie and choose interpret, main, and loop this video about 5 times. And the reason I want to do that is so that if I offset it, I still have room. And since it loops, it won't stutter when it gets to the end. If you know you're going to be using something over and over again, and it does take a lot of time to render, it's wise to render out, pieces of it. And then if you need to make changes to it, you can always re-render it out over that footage and it will then replace itself. So anyway, just a good idea all around. Now, the next thing I want to do is select this fractal noise, hit Control D, and make 3 copies of this layer. Then I'm going to offset this one about 5 seconds. And then I'm going to offset another one about 5 seconds also, so that basically we have these pieces of noise staggered. Now these ones kind of get cut off, so we want to extend them to the end. So I'm just going to drag them to the end, or I'm going to hit end on the keyboard, select both of these layers, holding down Shift and hit Alt end bracket, and it will bring those to the end. Now let's add some buttons. All right. In this case, we're just going to take the text tool, and I came up with a movie name for this tutorial. It's pretty intense. It's a PG-13 movie, so don't worry. Okay, and I'm gonna hit Control A or Apple A to select my text and bring up the text options by clicking on this little options box. And I want to get the text a little closer together, and we're gonna scale it up just a bit after we. Okay, and then also I want to turn the text black. Select it, choose black. All right, let's make the spacing 0. And let's enlarge it a little bit more. And let's make sure we're in the title or action safe here, and we are. And let's move on to the next thing. I want to add a cool glow to this layer. So with it selected, I'm going to choose Effects, Stylize, Glow. And we're going to change the glow to be based on the alpha channel. We're going to composite the original on top. And we're going to change the B color to a bright orange. And then we're going to zoom in and increase the intensity as well as the radius or the blur. So let's prepare the buttons. I'm going to choose Layer, New, Solid, and I'm going to make a black solid. And then I'm just going to grab this top here and just scale it down so it's a nice thin streak. Change the transfer mode to classic color burn. Bring the opacity down so that I can almost see through the layer. Maybe there, that looks pretty good. Maybe even a little bit more. Okay, that looks good. Then I'm going to take this layer, bring it down, and now I'm going to add some buttons onto this bar. And I'm going to hit return in here, type button bar, and that way we keep track. I'm going to take the text tool, click in here, and type play all. I'm going to hit Control A, and we're going to change the color to orange. And we're going to scale it down. Take the selection tool and move it over. Zoom in here. I want to take this black button bar and thin it out a little bit more. Maybe there. And then center this play all. Then with the play all selected, I'm going to hit Control D, duplicate it, and then slide it over. And we're just going to call this other button extras. Now you could add as many buttons as you want, but in this particular tutorial, I'm just going to use these 2 buttons. Let's go ahead and move on to the next menu. Now, before I move on, I want to go to the composition settings, and name this composition main menu. And that way we can just kind of keep track of it. And instead of creating a whole new menu, I'm just going to take this main menu in the project window, hit Control D or Apple D, duplicate it, hit return on the keyboard, and name it extras menu. And then I'm going to open up the extras menu. And of course, it's exactly the same, but I want to just change it up a little bit. So let me turn Death Streak into extras. And that way it's the extras menu. And then let me take the background layer and I'm going to scale it into a different position. So I'm just going to scale it up and just kind of zoom into maybe this bottom corner. let's see, maybe a little less. Okay, and the image is kind of fuzzy, so I'm going to turn on this collapse transformation switch, which will then resample from the original footage. So you can see I'm looking at the original image zoomed in, and then now I'm collapsing the transformations, which is going to sample from the original 8 megapixel picture. So this is looking pretty good. Now it's a little dark, so let's see if we can change some of the settings to brighten it up. Now there's this black solid that we have for our vignette. What if we brought the opacity of this down just so that the effect isn't so intense? And maybe our button bar we could delete altogether, and maybe we can move our buttons into a different spot. So let's take the extras button here and let's just move it over to the right side. And then I'm going to take the play all button and move it just up here. And if I had other buttons or other scenes, you know, I could make little squares for movie titles or whatever. I mean, you guys get the idea. I'm just going to line these up. And then I'm going to duplicate this bottom one, Control D, and move it down to like the bottom of the composition. Let me bring up the title safe. And we're just going to move it down here, and we're going to call this back. And this button will essentially get us back to the main menu or wherever we were last. And in this case, it will be the main menu. I'm going to go and shut off the title action safe. And back to this black layer, I'm going to just bring this mask in on this side so that the focus is drawn to our buttons, which are on the right side. So I'm going to increase the opacity to 25, 23. Okay. So this way it's kind of dark over here and makes you kind of focus specifically over here. Now I want to take this extras menu and just brighten up the glowing effect so it's a little bit more intense. So let's just increase the intensity, and that way it kind of matches with the original one. And the reason this one's more intense is because it's already on kind of a bright orange area. So we just want to kind of create some continuity here. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. We have 2 menus done now. So let's create a new folder in our project window called Menus. And let's drag our main menu and our extras menu inside of it. And then I'm going to put this background composition per pre-comp into the footage folder and just keep things a little organized here. So we have our 2 menus, looking pretty good here. Now we need to create transitions between these 2 menus. So there's basically 4 parts to create this menu effect. And if we were going to make an animation for each button, we would need 2 parts per button. But in this case, we're just going to focus on one aspect. So let's go ahead and make a new composition, and we'll just create the same NTSC DV composition, and we'll call this transition. Now in this composition, we need to bring in both of our menus. So I'm going to select both of these menus and drag them into our composition, hit Alt Home to bring them to the beginning. Now I'm going to zoom in here and go to about 5 seconds. Now I'm going to bring the extras menu to this point in time by hitting the begin bracket. Now the purpose of the transition is if somebody's on the main menu here and they click on the button extras, we want there to be a transition before we actually get to the menu, but eventually leads us to exactly the first frame of this animation. So the transition needs to start at one point and end with exactly where it's going to end. So the first frame of the transition needs to be the main menu, and the last frame of the transition needs to be the first frame of the destination, or in this case, the extras menu. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to still frame this extras menu. And the reason I'm going to still frame it is because if I offset this menu to create a transition, then it's going to end in a location that's not exactly the beginning. So I want to go to the beginning of this menu, right click, choose time, and freeze frame. And what the freeze frame will do is wherever you have your current time indicator, that's where it will freeze. So that anywhere beyond this will just be this one frame. And it's going to be such a quick transition that we're not going to even know that it's a still frame. So that's just a good idea for what we're doing. Because this one transition is actually going to play for both videos back and forth, I also want to make the main menu first frame a still frame also. So with the layer selected, I'm going to choose time freeze frame. So that now we just have 2 still frames basically. Let's add some animation. Let's make this kind of cool. So I'm going to go forward to where the beginning of this menu is, and I'm going to change the anchor point position. And my idea for the effect is, I'm going to bring the opacity down so we can see, my idea is I want this menu to be inside of like a hole, maybe inside of this window, and then the transition kind of super zooms into the hole, revealing the menu at full size. So to do that, I'm going to take this menu and move the anchor point to the location where I want the menu to be hiding before it gets zoomed into. So I think we're going to stick it inside of this little crevice on the main menu. So I'm going to take the pan behind tool, which is right here, and drag the anchor point for my extras menu right over top of this hole. And then I'm going to zoom in so that it's right in there. Very good. Okay. Now you're thinking, okay, why do I have to do that? Well, now if I scale in, if I bring the opacity back up and if I scale this property, it will go right into that hole, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to move forward about a second. So we're at 5 seconds. I'm going to move forward to about 6 seconds, or maybe a little bit less. And I'm going to set a scale keyframe. Then I'm going to go to the beginning of this layer and just shrink this thing down like a lot. So just scale it down so that it's right inside of that hole, maybe 1%, or maybe even less, 0.5, 0.25. Okay, so that it's just a little dot inside of this hole. Now, the trick is to make both of these layers zoom in at the same time to reveal this menu. Well, you could try to do it by hand, or you could set up a parent where whatever the animation is here, this layer will follow. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I'm going to take this pick whip and select the extras menu, and it's going to basically just follow this animation. And as it zooms in, it's going to also zoom in. Now the problem is this is a linear scale, so it zooms in almost instantly. We don't get to see any animation. So what I want to do is select these 2 keyframes by drawing a box around them, right-clicking on one of them, choosing keyframe assistance, and going to the exponential scale. And that creates a more realistic movement as if it were coming towards us. So as you can see, that's a pretty cool effect. And let's go and add a few enhancements. First, let's turn the motion blur on for these layers. So F4 to toggle the motion blur settings, and then turn on the global switch for the motion blur. Yes, very cool. Now, we can start seeing it, in my opinion, a little too soon. So about right here, I'm going to set an opacity keyframe, and I'm going to hit T on the keyboard, turn the stopwatch on, hit U to bring up all the keyframe parameters, and go forward to about just before it's all the way up, and also set a keyframe. Then I'm going to go back to the original keyframe by clicking back and just turning the opacity down to 0. Okay, so it looks kind of like it's hiding in the shadow there. Very cool. Now, if I want this blur to be, say, more intense, I can go to the composition settings, advanced, and increase the shutter angle. And actually, I've already done that. It usually defaults at about 180. So if you wanted to, you could increase it even more. But in this particular case, I'm just going to go ahead and leave it at 300. Okay, let's go ahead and preview this transition. Okay, well, let's go ahead and create like a flash effect just before the transition makes way. So I'm going to go layer, new adjustment layer, and I'm going to add a levels adjustment. So I'm going to go color correction, levels, and then at the very beginning of the animation, I'm going to set the stopwatch for the levels adjustment, move forward a couple of frames, increase the input white to kind of blow it out, go forward a couple more frames, and then just reset the property so that it only just flashes once. Then I'm going to go to the very end, and just as it finishes, I want to also set a keyframe. I'm just going to move the parameter and then move it back so that it sets a keyframe, or I can hit the U key and add one. Then I'm going to go forward a frame, bring it up and go to the end. Let me just move these keyframes over and reset it so that it also gets to its end position and flashes. Okay, let's go and preview this. Well, now we have a transition that plays from the main menu to the extras menu, but now we need to create a transition that plays from the extras menu back to the main menu. And to do that, we're going to go to the project, and we're just going to take this transition composition that we've created, that's here, and drag it into a new composition. And then we're just going to select the layer, choose time, and click time reverse layer. And that's just going to play it backwards. Now we have all the necessary elements to create two menus with transitions that go back and forth to each other. Now, the play all would essentially go play your feature movie. The extras would go to the extras menu, and in the extras menu you might have, these buttons might be something else like the movie trailer or, production stills and then back. But let's go ahead and render these out. I'm going to go to Composition, Add to Render Queue. And just undock this by holding Control and ripping it from its area. And I'm going to go to the extras, Composition, Add to Render Queue. Okay, and go to the first transition, Composition, Add to Render Queue. Second transition, Composition, Add to Render Queue. So now I have all my movies here. And now I'm going to set the output module for MPEG-2 DVD. These settings will basically export the video to MPEG-2 and you'll be good to go. But actually, I'm just going to render it out into a QuickTime movie at photo JPEG settings at 100% quality, just because I'm going to run it through a separate encoder. But you can, you're welcome just run it through that encoder. If you're on an Apple, you might want to use, QuickTime, Final Cut Pro, or, whatever. So I don't want to focus too much on that. I'm just going to use the QuickTime setting, and I'm just going to render these all out with the same settings. And we're going to bring them into Encore, and I'm going to show you how to put them together. So stay tuned for that portion.